Perfect. So that's a good start.
Yes, I should wait for your cue.
Yeah. So thank you very much to everybody for coming. It's good to see lots of people here, and hopefully there'll be more people coming in. I was going to say in and out, but we don't want people going out. People just come in and don't go anywhere. So it'll be good to have some more people coming in too. So we're very lucky to be getting a talk from Bob tonight, and anybody that's read anything about Bob will know that he's got quite a career of many different hats. So it's very amazing to read what I have about you, and the fact you've been a Royal Marine officer, and well, obviously an Arctic explorer as well, self-styled Arctic explorer, wasn't it? So, and
Yeah.
as well.
Self-styled, of course.
And it's just amazing that you've been to lots of places that not many people really have, and it's I'm really looking forward to hearing about your journey to Greenland and Baffin with the Wild Bunch as well. So when we did our little test yesterday, I was eager to see more of the slides and find out more of the stories too. So basically, what you've not done, it probably doesn't exist. So
That's a nice thought.
so I'll let you take over and get started. I'll stop wittering on.
Okay, well, thank you very much, and very nice to meet you all, even if it's only virtually. I don't know what I can say after that high-flown introduction, but uh, there is just one hang-up about my slideshows, and that is that by now it's become almost obligatory for me to start with the Dodo's Delight signature tune, even when the slideshow doesn't include the Wild Bunch, but at least it does this time include the Wild Bunch, so it has more pertinence. I remember actually I had to give a lecture to the Royal Yacht Squadron, which was quite an honor. But even there, a Lord Chief Justice of England was heard to murmur, "You will start with the video, Bob, won't you?" So I'm afraid you'll have to endure the video. It starts rather slowly and quietly, but it does increase in volume and in extent. No, just start slow and then one. 1, 2, 3. No, start 10. A little slow. 1, 2, 3. When there's fixed a storm at sea and all the ships are safe at shore, there's a tiny little sailboat that keeps sailing on for more. Oh, through hurricanes and cyclones, 40 meters waves and more. What's the name of that mighty sailboat that never goes to shore? It's the Dodo's Delight, it's the Dodo's Delight, shining bright and blue and white. It's the Dodo's Delight, it's the Dodo's Delight, it's the Dodo's Delight, shining bright and blue and white. It's the Dodo's Delight. Oh, she sails straight to an iceberg like butter to a knife. She's bouncing over rocks like a chicken on the moon. Oh, well, tell me who's the captain who commands that mighty ship? It's Captain Reverend Bob, here the cracking of the whip. It's the Dodo's Delight, it's the Dodo's Delight, shining bright and blue and white. It's the Dodo's Delight, it's the Dodo's Delight, it's the Dodo's Delight, shining bright and blue and white. It's the Dodo's Delight. But she's always nice and tidy, and the deck is always clear. There's wine and chocolate plenty, the captain's never knew. What's that sound, boy, can you hear it? It's like music to my ear. It's the sound of dodo singing. I can hear it loud and clear. It's the dodo delight. It's the dodo delight. Shining bright and blue and white. It's the dodo delight. It's the dodo delight. It's the dodo delight. Shining bright and blue and white. It's the dodo delight. If you want to sail the dodo, well, you better be tough. The crew is not so pretty, they're looking kind of rough. They don't always smell like roses, they're sucked off the tank. And if they were to stop, they were made to walk the plank. It's the dodo delight, it's the dodo delight. Shining bright and blue and white, it's the dodo delight. It's the dodo delight, it's the dodo delight. Shining bright and blue and white, it's the dodo delight. Well, there's Dolly on the sweet box, Nico on his mandolin. Oh, Storm played with his whistle, the spoons are played by Finn. Oh, well, tell me what's the venue, where's the concert on tonight? In the middle of the ocean on the dodo delight. It's the dodo delight, it's the dodo delight. Shining bright and blue and white, it's the dodo delight. It's the dodo delight, it's the dodo delight. Shining bright and blue and white, it's the dodo delight. I am Captain Norfolk, and I like to neat and tidy, sailing on a bowling hard on the wind. We will cross the ocean, we will weave through the ice. And why? Because it's nice. It's the dodo delight, it's the dodo delight. Shining bright and blue and white, it's the dodo delight. It's the dodo delight, it's the dodo delight. Shining bright and blue and white, it's the dodo delight. Shining bright and blue and white, it's the dodo delight. It's the dodo delight, it's the dodo delight. Shining bright and blue and white, it's the dodo delight.
Yes, I know that. I saw that.
Fuel the moment. Ready to drop. We are getting closer to Iceberg Field.
Okay. I never have understood how Sean could hang upside down at the top of the mast like that. But as you'll have gathered, as well as being superb professional climbers, one of the things I like about them is that though they climb very serious stuff, they don't take themselves too seriously, as you've just seen. So who are they? Well, there's Sean, Nico, Ollie. Sean and Nico and Ollie are brothers. They are Belgian, and there's Ben Ditto, who is American. And they are professional climbers, and they are superb at it. They're also actually quite, as you would have just realized, good musicians. So let's continue on. I want to just talk about the boat. It's a westerly 33-foot discus, as they called it. It's a standard production boat, fiberglass, which isn't the best material in icy conditions, but it's the only boat I had, and I couldn't afford to steal one. It's a standard production boat, except I've made two modifications. When my son, who originally trained as a boat builder, learned that we were going to Antarctica and around Cape Horn and the Southern Ocean on one trip, instead of a spray hood, he bought that solid, he made that solid fiberglass cuddy. And then over the years, I have incorporated an inner forestay, which wasn't in the original spec for the boat. First of all, a removable inner forestay, and then a permanent inner forestay, and then finally with a roller reefing head sail on it, which can be a number 3 jib or roll down to be a storm jib. And why? Well, because those are the very conditions when you do not want to go up to the foredeck and hank on sails or raised sails. You want to be able to control everything from the cockpit, and that's what we can do. So enough of the boat. When we returned from the Northwest Passage, we ended up here at Aasiaat. Oops. Oh, yes. So it's just a quick map, Greenland and Aasiaat, as I say. And here is Baffin. And one of the reasons why I've included this is our double transit of the Northwest Passage. Hopefully one day I'll come to Orkney and perhaps talk about the Northwest Passage, because this is John Ray territory completely. Here's Hudson Bay down here. He worked for the Hudson Bay Company, and he used his dog sled to go thousands of miles around this area. And in fact, he was responsible for finding the last piece in the jigsaw of the Northwest Passage, which is that little strait there. People thought that King William Island here was part of Boothia Peninsula, but John Ray from his dog sled saw that there was a flat stretch of ice-filled sea there. And that allowed Amazon to come down here and to stay at the Inuit settlement, which then got the name of Joe Haven from his name, Joe, G-J-O-A, and opened up the Northwest Passage. I also like to include it because Maggie Nelson, who does these maps for magazines and lectures and journals and books, just works away quietly in the background and gets no praise. And I'd just like to thank her very much for what she does. Well, when we returned from the Northwest Passage to Aasiaat, we were forced to moor up against another boat in this trot for the winter. I say we were forced because in previous winters, or on 2 occasions, I had lifted out at the boatyard in Aasiaat, which is probably the main boatyard on the west coast of Greenland. And here we were one year lifted out. But since then, it's been taken over, a new manager, and he'd been told to make it pay. And the fees had gone up from about £1,000 to £6,000. And there was no way that I was able to pay £6,000. So I moored up against Anna, a Swedish boat, a very nice steel, Colin Archer, who were also going to spend the winter there, and left it there and went back home. When I came back the next year for this expedition, the other boats had gone. It was just Anna and myself, or ourselves, left there. I had to borrow a dinghy from the Seamen's Mission, which is just behind where I'm standing to take this picture, in order to get there. But when I got to the boat and had a look round, all seemed to be well, until I looked a little bit more closely, and oh dear, significant damage done to the top sides and the tow rail there. Well, what had happened was, I learned afterwards, that just before the harbour and therefore the boats got iced in, there was a huge storm. This fender wasn't there at the time. That's an afterthought put in after it was all done. I had got fenders and rubber tires and everything, but they were quickly torn or deflated or in some ways disappeared, and the boat was smashed up against the steel column archer and suffered this damage. Well, obviously, this was a bit of a crisis. But thinking about it a little bit more quietly, I decided to attempt a repair. So all I could do was buy loads of fiberglass two-part paste and fill in the damaged area, the wound, fill in the cracks as much as possible. And by the time I finished, it looked quite good. Not actually, it wasn't actually quite as good as it looked, as we found out 2 years later, but that's another story altogether. But this did mean that I didn't have to email the Wild Bunch and say, don't come after all, the boat's been bashed and we can't really sail, because now we could. And sure enough, the Wild Bunch, in typical Wild Bunch fashion, arrived. By that time, I'd moved the boat over to that jetty, which I showed you earlier on, and moored up against a big fishing boat with a lot of deck space, and the Wild Bunch arrived. I had actually caught an email from Ben, which said something like, I think I'll bring bolts just in case. Well, being a traditional climber, and therefore disliking the thought of bolts drilled into rock, whether for protection or aid, I had got hold of a big container and written no bolts on it. And when they arrived, Ben knew exactly what to do to repulse that suggestion in a rude way, of course. So we bought stores, we filled with fuel, we generally made preparations, and then we set sail. About 2 miles north of Assiat, as we rounded a small island, we found a school of whales, which put on a huge show for us, which was really rather a pleasant opening to our voyage. We started quite late in the day, probably about midday or early afternoon. So it's 85 miles across Disco Bay. So in fact, overnight we went into, yes, difficult to pronounce, Kroonprinsen Eiland, which in English means Crown Prince Island. It was quite tricky to get in because the narrow entrance had a rock and a submerged rock in the middle, but it was a very pleasant pool when we got here, and there was the interest of this settlement, which obviously now was abandoned and disintegrated. Ben went ashore and put up a time-lapse camera overnight, and in the film that Sean made of the expedition, they always make a film of their expeditions, there's a picture of an iceberg going quite rapidly across the gap here. And then halfway through the night, the tide turned, the boat was facing the other way, and oh, lo and behold, the iceberg came back very quickly across the gap, which was made rather an interesting picture. Well, next day we continued up the west side of Disco Island and around into the huge Umanak Fjord. But as you can see, the mist was beginning to creep up on us. And in fact, eventually it enveloped us completely. And what was strange was not only did the mist and clag envelop us, but there was a strong wind with it, and the strong wind was against us. So all I could think of doing was, I did notice a little knuckle on the chart plotter in the coastline to starboard of us. So I thought, well, let's just see whether we can get some shelter down there, because this is really unpleasant in this clag with a strong west wind against us, or wind coming from the east against us. So we turned to starboard and we went towards the coast, And suddenly we came out of it all into completely calm weather, sunshine, with the mist and the clag and the wind all there behind us. And so we had an enjoyable day chilling out. The lads went ashore and walked up a hill just to keep themselves fit, and we chilled out generally. Next day, we continued down Umnak Fjord, and I should have explained really, well, I did explain that the Wild Bunch, as well as being superb climbers, there's always music. So much so that they even take their musical instruments, they haul them up their big wall climbs behind them, which perhaps is just as well, because on one of our climbs, it rained and they were rained off for 3 days. And so they just sat on their portaledges halfway up the big wall and under the tent on the portaledge and played their musical instruments, composing new songs for 3 days. Well, we continued on and we broke through a little channel through the shoreline to come round into another fjord, making for the iconic mountain just above a settlement here, Ikerasak. You can't see it because it's in shadow. And then we moored up against a fishing boat at about 6 o'clock in the morning and again chilled out. We soon went for a reconnaissance in the nearby fjord, but it was really to no avail. They thought the rock looked a bit loose. The lines weren't that big. And so we came back to Ikerasak and they took a closer look at this iconic mountain. Sean went up and had a look, and he thought that this ridge or this arête here would go. I don't know why we got that. Right. He thought that arête there would go. Wasn't so loose, he thought. And of course, there was this classic alpine type arête or ridge line on the left-hand side of this mountain. So they determined to go here. Oops. Yeah, go on. Oops.
Au moins une belle vue, quoi. My God, what a shock! The boat, it turned right over. It turned 9 times around, and the poor old dog was drowned. Oh, the rest of the Irish road. What I'd really like to do is push the boat down into that and see whether it would open it up enough to actually crack it open.
Does not seem like a good idea, Bob. I think the only thing that's going to crack open is the bow itself.
Well, that is a slight inconvenience to the operation, I grant you.
We have an iceberg that's grounded on top of our anchor, so we can't take the anchor up, so we're stuck here.
The idea is to lighten the ice flow so that when it's high water, it floats.
So Bob has prepared some hammers and axes, And he's going to try and break the iceberg. Oh my God, it looks like a bad idea.
Don't get that overhang falling on you.
So as you can see, our captain has gone mad. Oh, jeepers.
Well, he works, actually. Whoa, Bob, stay here.
Bob, let it go, let it go.
Move away, Bob, move away, move away, move away.
Oh my God. He is Moses. Oh my God. Oh my God. He was there just a few seconds ago. He was there.
What happened?
Like Moses to the Red Sea. He cut through the iceberg with an axe. Look at that thing.
You must have great strength, Bob.
It's got off the anchor, I think, Bob.
I'm glad I moved away when that big fish came out.
Yeah.
Oh, they crashed. She got 3 blows from that and the thing exploded. Well, anyhow, we retrieved our object.
Okay. I forgot to tell you why I called them the Wild Bunch. Was really when I'd never met them, they had written to me and said, do you know where there are any big walls in Greenland that we might climb? And I'd written back and said, yes, I do know where there are some big walls. What about you coming this summer? We'll see whether we can raise the finance. And they did come. But without having met them, I looked at their website, and whenever they got, as you've just seen in that video, whenever they got to the top of one of those huge climbs, they danced up and down, jumped, sang, danced, and high fives, and all the rest of it. So I dubbed them the Wild Bunch, and somehow the name had stuck. Well, we went exploring after that little intermission, and they were quite keen on this buttress, which I immediately named Goliath because it was big, bold, brazen, and beastly. I hope I'm not stretching your biblical knowledge too much. But there was a ledge here at the bottom that they could land on and survey the climb. I thought it would all be solid rock, but in fact, this band of black rock, I'm not sure, not being a geologist, what it consists of, but it turned out to be fearfully loose. And poor Ben hates loose rock. I think he must have done a lot of sport climbing in America, where the climb is protected by bolts or gear. And so you can climb at an extreme standard, but you know if you fall off that you're not going to fall to the bottom. Anyhow, be that as it may, he got through this and they began to make their climbs. It was interesting, the nature of the rock. It was always like solidified sandstone, but it was surprisingly solid. It slightly amuses me that nowadays climbers, their rock shoes are so tight on their feet that when they stop at the belay, whether they're standing or sitting, they tend to take the rock shoes off and wait until it's their turn to climb again before putting them back on. So here's Nico leading off on this crack line on the left-hand side of the buttress, and Sean leading here on the right-hand side. And not for people of the ability of the Wild Bunch, these two climbs, they were in the extreme grades, but they weren't that high up, about grade E3 or E4, and about 500 meters of climbing, a big wall climb, and worthy summits. When they got to the top, then they had to walk all the way along this ridge, because that was the buttress there, all the way along this ridge before they could find a scree slope that allowed them to come down to the water's edge. I had moved, in the meantime, moved the boat around to here to pick them up. Well, we thought we'd go and have a look at the north side of the island and chill out there. And we actually found this delightful pool between an outlying island on the left-hand side there and the main island here. And we set up our anchors and a rope ashore. And for 2 or 3 days, they went bouldering. If you're chilling out and relaxing, then you still go bouldering just to keep your fingers and toes and body in trim. This obviously is Nico and Ollie having lunch, but Sean, of course, was climbing. Sean loves nothing better than climbing. Doesn't matter what it is, wet, greasy, mossy, grassy, overhanging, chimneys, cracks. As long as he's climbing, he's happy. So he continued climbing while they had their lunch. Well, after 2 or 3 days, Windy Gulch, as I came to call it, there was a very, very strong wind blowing down this fjord, and it was time to move out. We had quite some difficulty getting our line back in these conditions. It's difficult to take pictures of stormy conditions, just still pictures, because it always seems to flatten out the sea, and it's usually worse than it looks in the picture. But difficulty getting that line and also getting our anchor back here, and we had put an anchor out the stern for when we swung round, and indeed we were swung round, because in these mountainous districts the wind goes round and round. So we retrieved eventually both anchors and the line ashore, and we made for the gap. In that video, the first video, where I'm shouting, "This is ridiculous," it's actually where we're putting out through the gap, a very narrow gap between the island and the main island, in about 40 to 42 knots of wind. Well, we spent the rest of the day looking around for a suitable anchorage. But another problem of anchoring in the Arctic is that the fjords are very deep, and also the shorelines are steep too. So we had great difficulty finding anywhere. And in the end, we eventually gave up, and here we are sailing across to Umanak Island. And I knew that on the northwest side of the island, there was a bay called West Bay, and the wind was in the south, so this was the obvious place to make for. But I hadn't been in there before, but I saw somewhere over this shoulder ahead of us, a mast sticking up. So I phoned them on the VHF and I said, haven't been in there before, and have you any advice as to how to enter it? Because I have heard that there is a few rocks around. And they replied and said, as long as you keep close to the shore all the way around, you'll be all right. So that's what we did. And so we made our way in and anchored there in West Bay under, again, an iconic mountain of Umanak. Umanak actually means heart, but I think it must be a seal's heart because it doesn't bear any resemblance to a human heart. But anyhow, we had got in and we'd found enough depth for putting our anchor down. We'd rushed past the other boat, Francis B, who kindly advised us. They gave us a bit of a rocket for that afterwards. Why didn't we stop and talk to them? But all was well. Next day, we went to town because we wanted to buy stores and eventually we wanted to get fuel as well. So we continued on our way past the latest recruits for the winter dog sledding and past, well, I don't know really what they are. We never did discover what these things were outside this hunter's house. Well, we continued on and made our way to Umanak, but oh my goodness, look at this. The harbor is absolutely chock full of ice. There is absolutely no way we could have got a boat in there yesterday, and no way we can get it in there today. So all we could do was buy some stores, as much as we could actually fit into our rucksacks that we had taken with us, and walk back to the boat. And here we are, the crew, the happy crew, making their way back to the boat. The other boat, Francis B, had also gone to town, and when they returned, they came on board. And of course, inevitably, the Wild Bunch got their instruments out, and we settled down to a jam session and a good sing-song together, which they thoroughly enjoyed. So much so that they asked us back to lunch, where, of course, we went across, enjoyed lunch, and then we had another jam session and sing-song together, and a thoroughly happy time. Well, we continued looking for routes to do, and they were quite attracted by this 500-meter wall here, which they eventually named Punky Wall. I landed them from the dinghy on the beach here, and they made their way and started to explore. you get some idea of the scale when you realize that that little dot there is actually our boat at anchor below this rock wall of the Punky Wall. And this is Sean leading. You get an even better perspective of the size when I point out that these two little figures is Sean and Ben here on this vast wall that they are climbing. Ben was having a terrible time because the rock was loose. Nico and Ollie had already given up and aborted and come back to the boat. But Sean, of course, wanted to complete the climb. So he took over all the leading and they climbed on, and poor Ben and dear Ben managed to follow him afterwards, seconding, and they made gradual progress up this wall. They actually took a picture from the wall of us there drifting around waiting for them. And I include it because it shows what we all know, but very graphically, that there is a lot more of an iceberg below the water than there is above the water. And it was a clear illustration of the point here. Well, when they were getting near the top, Ben shouted out to Sean above, "How's it going?" "Terrible," said Sean, even Sean. He couldn't find anything for his hands or feet. But eventually, by sheer grit and perseverance, they made it to the top and celebrated in the usual Wild Bunch manner, which is how they got their name. Well, they were able to walk off down the back quite easily. My wife always queries this climbing business. Why do they climb up all these hard walls when they could have just walked up quite easily at the back of the mountain? Well, that is, I suppose, another perspective on rock climbing and climbing big walls. We had brought the boat round the corner and anchored in this little cove to make it easy for them to reach us. And I include this picture often because it's such a graphic illustration of the beauty of Greenland in the summer there when we picked them up. Well, we weaved through icebergs here. And again, of course, we went bouldering, some with more success than others. In fact, I quickly came to the conclusion that if you're climbing with professional climbers, it's best just to let them get on with it, which is what I did. So we chilled out here, and it's such a beautiful land. It always strikes me how marvelous it is. I can't think why people actually sail anywhere else, but don't all come up here because we want to keep it for ourselves, of course, very selfishly. But of course, we must also realize that we are imposters. The Inuit have been surviving here for centuries. And in fact, here is an Inuit in a Eskimo canoe. And for those who are technically minded, it's quite interesting to me that the Inuit never feathered their paddles at right angles and turned the wrist in order to combat a wind against you. What they did was they went for long bladed paddles. And I have found actually, experimenting with this, that the long blade moves just as much water as a shorter, wider blade. And this was their way of combating paddling into the wind. But they've been surviving here. We have only just encroached on their territory. But at last, the main point of this expedition was to get across to Baffin and climb big walls there. We were just biding our time here in Greenland and putting up some big walls while we waited. The problem with Baffin is, though, that the ice which hugs the east coast here of Baffin tends to stay there much longer than it does on the west coast of Greenland. But here at last, it was coming away from the coastline, and we thought we would give it a go. So we hurried round to Umanak, which was now clear of ice. We bought stores, we filled up with fuel, and we set sail across. I do actually have a better chart of this, but it illustrates the trip quite well. We started here in Aasiaat, We'd gone up to Umanak. We spent a month here climbing and waiting. But now we were making our way across to Clyde River and then up to Sam Fjord and Gibbs Fjord. Just want to emphasize that. That's Sam Fjord there, Walker Arm, the Walker Citadel, the Walker Inlet, and something called the Turret here, because we'll be coming across those as we go on. Well, actually the voyage across was not that easy. Again, the pictures rather flattened out the seas. There was a strong north wind and northwest wind. At least it wasn't right on the nose, but it was a pretty lively passage across, and we had to work quite hard. But imagine our surprise on the fourth day, or the morning, early morning of the fourth day, as we approached the coast of Baffin, about 75, 80 miles off the coast of Baffin, we came across huge fields of pack ice and ice floes. Ben, poor chap, was on the wheel at the time. He practically threw the wheel at me. But we were able to find, well, actually quite wide leads through this vast field of pack ice. And as we made our way through, Ben counted no less than 8 polar bears. I was a little bit concerned about this because I thought 75 miles, 80 miles off the coast, that's a very long swim, especially with young cubs, to get back again. I needn't have worried because I was told later that they had tracked a polar bear who had swum for 300 miles. So 75 or 80 miles off the coast was nothing to them. We spent the whole day making our way through these fields of pack ice in order to get down to Clyde River here. At Clyde River, we noticed these dories, rather unique on this side of Baffin Bay, or rather a unique bow shape. I hadn't actually seen that type of dory before. Nowadays, the Inuit are not hunting in kayaks with a harpoon. They go out in these dories with powerful engines on the Greenland side, grant aided by the Danish government. I'm not quite sure what happens here on the Canadian side, but it's still in many ways a hunting and fishing community, subsistence existence. So we came here, we checked in at the police station here, and we paid the princely sum of $25 for our rifle in case of polar bears. And one of the policemen bought a copy of my book, which was very kind of him. So we took the opportunity of restoring stores, filling up again with diesel, and made our way round towards Sam Fjord Field. Crossing this iceberg, which actually may well have actually started on the west coast of Greenland, because the current would have taken it up into Melville Bay at the top of Baffin Bay, and then here it was coming down and round down the southeast coast of Baffin, past Labrador, and it would eventually have disintegrated off Newfoundland, or as it got into the Gulf Stream in the Atlantic. But we passed it in order to get down into Sam Fjord Fjord here, and then we turned up Walker Inlet and right into Walker Inlet itself here, with the Walker Citadel to our right. We actually had quite a job finding anywhere to anchor, because as I was telling you, these fjords are very, very steep, and we went all the way round looking for sufficiently shallow depth to anchor. And just as we got to this point, the engine stopped. Well, the echo sounder was reading 10 to 15 meters. It might just hold. Throw the anchor out, lads. And we almost literally did that, threw it out, and it did hold the boat long enough for us to sort ourselves out, to find that it was my mistake, that I had underestimated the amount of fuel used, and we'd run out of fuel, so we were able to refuel, bleed the engine, and move to a better position. By the time that we really got settled here, we had an anchor out in front of us, a line ashore, and another anchor on a long, long line astern, ready for when the wind would spin us round, which certainly it did. Well, imagine our surprise one morning, we hadn't seen another sailing boat the whole of summer so far. Plenty of Inuit dories, but no sailing boat. Well, we came up nonchalantly on deck one morning, and there was this big black beast of a boat. It was 60 foot long, aluminium, and had a curious rig, 2 masts. It was a schooner, yes, but neither mast had stays, and both booms were actually built into the mast. And so you had a forward part of the boom and an aft part of the boom, and each had a foresail and a mainsail on it. It's called an aero rig, and a very powerful rig it is. And in fact, it was Steve Brown in his boat, Navara. And he had come looking for us. He called in at Clyde River to check in like we had with the police, and they'd said that we were ahead of him. He knew what we were trying to do, climb these big walls, and so he'd come look. He nearly missed us because that fjord, Walker Inlet's about 2 miles long. Just as he was about to give up, he saw what could have been a mast in the far distance, which actually turned out to be our boat. Well, it was a great day. We went across to him, of course. We had coffee. We were invited to go across again in the evening, which was surprising, to invite the Wild Bunch twice. I'm only joking. And we had a thoroughly pleasant evening together. Not quite as hilarious as the filmmakers Real Rock like to make out. Wasn't quite as a drunken brawl as they wanted to portray, but it was a very pleasant evening together. And this is where I gave or dubbed Navara the luxury liner, which it really was, because it was all very luxurious. We were fed very well, more red wine, it kept coming up, and we had a thoroughly interesting and pleasant evening. Well, in the night, and of course the nights are still daylight, we went back to our boat. And I thought, oh, great, at last I can get into our bunk and we can get some sleep. Nico, what are you doing? Oh, well, we're making sandwiches because we're going climbing now. And so off they went in order to climb the Walker Spire here, right up to the top of this tower. And here they are, starting in the dusky light of the early hours of the morning and making progress up the climb, even though I did have to conclude that it was more wine-induced than wise what they were doing, but they're the kings in the climbing world, so it wasn't for me to say anything. And indeed, they began to make progress up this very hard, extreme route. I found myself in the meantime taking Sean and Ben across the fjord, about 4 miles across, to a big buttress the other side, which actually was that buttress there, which they did succeed in climbing. But I'll just go back to that one. As you can see, the weather has drawn in. And perhaps this was just as well, because Nico and Ollie are the half or about 2/3 of the way up here. The weather changed, it rained, it snowed, and they wisely decided to abort. And so they rigged up the ropes, they upside down, and they came back down to the boat. Well, with hindsight, we should have done something about the other party, Sean and Ben, over the side here, but they had a VHF, a handheld VHF. We had the VHF switched on the boat. We tried calling them. We got no answer. We didn't hear anything from them. So we thought, well, we'll go around in the morning. So we had a night's sleep, and without hurrying at all, we then went round the next day. We had some difficulty finding them because when you get over there, it's actually quite a lot of rock, and the conditions were pretty rough. Not a very good picture, but I just wanted to show you that here is Ollie taking the dinghy, the little rubber Avon dinghy, across in pretty lively conditions in order to pick up Sean and Ben, who were very glad to be picked up. And their account was that they'd mastered their climb, they climbed the climb, and it was a great climb, but they then had to wait for 12 hours under a big boulder, sheltering from the wind and the snow and the cloud and the general bad weather. So they were rather delighted to be picked up. Well, the weather had definitely turned for the worst for a while. And what do you do if there's bad weather outside and you're a climber? Well, you find a cave and then you invent a system with a chalk there in order to keep your fingers in trim, or you exercise your arms, just generally to have a workout ready for the next climb. Well, it was all too much effort for some of us who had better things to do. Sean at one stage decided that he was going to demonstrate a perfect dive into the Arctic Sea. They did have a propensity for jumping into the Arctic water. This wasn't entirely stupid because it was really the only way to wash. It's a small boat. It only has a 200-liter water tank, and all fresh water was for drinking and for cooking. So there was no way to wash except by jumping in the sea. But of course, Sean had then to do his still life impression sitting on an ice floe. And well, I really don't know why. But the caption reads, "No wonder we had no trouble from polar bears," because here is Sean ashore. Yes, okay, we'll pass hastily over that. Because here am I saying, whatever will they get up to next? Well, actually, what they did get up to was that Nico and Ollie went once again to what was now known as Drunken Tower to start and attempt to climb this 1,000-meter face of the Walker Pinnacle. And unremittingly steep, really serious climbing. And it was as well that they had aborted on the previous attempt, because it turned out that this last tower was technically the most difficult part of the climb. It was E6, 6B, for those of you who are into climbing, and it was 1,000 meters high altogether. And they got to the top amidst, of course, the usual Wild Bunch rejoicing. And they really had something to rejoice about, because this was a momentous route that they had just done. They did have a bit of difficulty getting down, because it's not the easiest thing climbing down a snow gully in trainers, no crampons, of course, and no axe, just rock climbing gear. But anyhow, they made it safely down. All along, I had been impressed with what I can only call the incredible rock structure of the whole place. In my terms, of course, the wonders of God's creation. It did actually also show, though, how the glaciers were receding. And this was even more clear in the far distance, where the trim line here, I've been reliably informed that's a technical term, showed where the glacier had been in past ages. There's no doubt that there is climate change. Whether it's all due to us is a debatable point. But whether it is or not, we ought to do all that we possibly can to alleviate the situation, which was so clearly demonstrated here in these fjords, in this glacial, unspoiled, pristine land. Well, Nico and Ollie also wanted to climb the turret and the east face of the turret, because nobody had climbed it before. And they chose this really steep line, of course, right to the top. So I duly took them across and landed them on the scree there. They kept the dinghy this time, and they had landed here, and I think they bivvied here and then started on the climb. It again was a technically hard climb, 900 meters. And but as Nico put it, the cracks just kept on coming. So they gradually made their way up higher and higher and got right to the top. When they got to the top, they abseiled down to a convenient ledge to take a shiver bivvy, because it was getting dark at night now. We're well into August. And so they put on all the clothes that they could find and the survival sheet over the top of them in order to get about 4 hours sleep. That's about all you get, because however much clothing you put on, however much you wrap up, the cold will eventually wake you up after about 4 hours. So they continued on down, but first of all, when they woke up in the morning, here they were above the cloud level. There was a temporary inversion, and the whole of Sandford Fjord and the Walker Inlet was hidden in cloud below them. They continued to abseil down and came down this face and then around this ledge here and picked up the dinghy to get back to the boat. If you think it looks pretty easy to get back to the boat, I have to tell you that it wasn't on this occasion. This picture was taken before a big wind came in. And trying to pick up two people with their gear in a little rubber dinghy in winds gusting to 30 knots is extremely difficult. I first of all tried to go upwind towards them, but as soon as I got anywhere close, the wind would blow the bow off and it was a complete failure. So in the end, I came downwind and just managed to really slowly by putting the engine in reverse in bursts to slow right down. Eventually, I hit the dinghy. They were able to grab the guardrails, threw their gear onto the boat and levered themselves up, and we were once again safe and sound and in business. But it had been quite difficult. Well, from here, we wanted to go round to Gibbs Fjord because we'd heard that there was some climbing there and we wanted to explore it. And we went up spent a whole day going up this fjord. It was quite a long way, about 10 miles up there, looking at the rock on either side. But they were having difficulty finding a route that they could do. They thought the rock looked pretty loose. Some of it wasn't really hard enough or consistent enough to make a big wall climb. But finally, having looked around everywhere, as it were, they did see an arête that looked as if it might go, but they weren't quite sure of the quality of rock. So the next day, they walked up and as far as up the easy ground to the bottom of the arête. They pitched a tent there, chilled out until the next day, and then they started on their climb. The rock was surprisingly good. It wasn't loose as they feared, and it was hard. Here there is Nico in an off-width crack, which is a hard thing to climb because it's neither one thing or another. It's not a chimney, and it's not a crack line just for your fingers and toes. So he's striving to get up there. The route continued up, extreme rock as you would expect. You just see Nico there right at the top, up this very steep pitch. And of course, Sean had to climb this pinnacle, which wasn't actually part of the route. And why? Well, because it's there, and because Sean likes to climb everything. And indeed, it did make a rather striking picture. But, oh horrors. Here we are on a rock climb in rock shoes, no crampons, no gloves, no axes, and there was this band of snow, quite a wide band of snow right across the face. Well, Sean invented a new climbing technique, which was to hold one hand out in the sun in order for it to thaw out. Then when it had warmed up, you put that hand back and you held the other hand out. And in this way, they made their way to the top. And they climbed this amazing route again, 900 meters, I think it was, E6 once again, a really formidable climb, a really worthy climb. which they had done in Gibbs Fjord. We retired to Refuge Harbour. Not quite so much of a refuge, because underneath here is a big, big silt bank left by the glacier which has receded. But Sean was keen to try this rather good-looking pointed peak there in the distance and asked who would want to go with him. Well, there was an ominous silence. So we began to chew over, well, are we really going to go anymore, lads? Because after all, it had snowed, winter was coming, we're into September now. And so finally, I made the decision, okay, folks, it's time to go home. So that's what we did. It wasn't actually quite as easy as it sounds, because it was dark at night now, and outside there, going round from Gibbs Fjord back to Clyde River, where we are here, there was quite a lot of ice. And so we hove to overnight. That's a way of getting the boat stationary and just drifting, keeping an anchor watch without putting an anchor down, of course, until we could see better the next day. And again, here we are in Clyde River, and this ice flow had taken a liking to the boat and also to our anchor, and Ollie and I had quite a job to free the boat and the anchor from this while the other two were ashore. Why the Wild Bunch chose to have a concert halfway up the mast of the Spreaders, I will never know, but they did. Whether it was to entertain the Inuit population, I'm not sure, but I'm not sure that the Inuit population was that entertained, but they much enjoyed having this concert in rather strange circumstances. Well, even the birds had thought it was time to go south. And so we followed suit. We checked out at the Clyde River with the police and made our way down, not towards Asiat this time, but towards the Simiut, where I had heard there was a more user-friendly harbour where I might be able to lift the boat out. All was quite easy and all went well until we were really close to Simiut. And as we were approaching the sort of final channel in, which is a narrow defile with rocks and a rocky island either side, it chose to be extremely stormy. Here is Holly actually thoroughly enjoying conning the boat in these conditions. It got up to about 44 knots. We were actually pretty well bashed onto our side at one stage, almost flat on our side, in a gust of 44 knots as we made our way through. So, and there were big, big Atlantic rollers coming, or Atlantic type rollers coming up Baffin Bay and smashing into us as we made our way through. So it was quite a hard and fitting ending to a thoroughly enjoyable expedition. But we finally were able to turn up into wind to take the mainsail down. And here we are a day later with Ben holding up his hands. I like to think he's holding up his hands to heaven in gratitude, but knowing my friend Ben, that's probably not the case. But unfortunately, in that sense, it was time for the Wild Bunch to pull out, pack up their gear, catch the plane, and go back home. Not, of course, without having a jam session at Kangerlussuaq Airport on the way, whilst they were waiting for the plane from there to Copenhagen. Meantime, I negotiated for the boat and set about having it lifted out, which was actually quite an adventure in itself, because these rails aren't actually attached to the ground at all. They're just laid there, but the wheels of the trailer stayed on and the boat stayed on the trailer, and we were pushed forward, and here we are settled on the jetty or the quay side there, ready for the winter. I closed the boat down, took instruments to the boathouse at this boat yard. It was very, very friendly and very helpful and much more economical than Asiat. So it was feasible to lift out for the winter. But here was the end of a very hard, but a very successful and happy expedition with the Wild Bunch once again. If by any chance you don't have a copy of my book, it's not just this expedition, it's adventures over many years. It is available from Amazon, or you could email me and I could send you a copy. I don't expect any of you are wanting to go to the Arctic, but if you are, we have also written a book, High Latitude Sailing, which is a bit more of a manual. But I was very pleased the way Lard Coles has dealt with the pictures. Some of the pictures are really quite powerful in that book. And just to round things off, I'm just in the process of now writing another book called Addicted to More Adventure, with a few more adventures in it. Well, thank you very much for listening. And I hope you enjoyed the Wild Bunch. And sometime I hope to meet you all in person. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bob. That was incredibly entertaining. And I know it must be difficult for you not being able to hear people, but I assume it wasn't just me that was sitting here laughing away to myself.
Yes, well, you can't fail with the Wild Bunch, really.
Yeah, I can imagine. And I don't as an accordion player myself, I have no idea how they managed to get up the mast. I struggle to get up the stairs.
Yeah.
It's quite an achievement in itself.
Well, that's true.
No, that was really fantastic. I really enjoyed that. And it's amazing to see the rock formations and things like that. It's just it's just unbelievable.
Yeah.
And the moody skies.
A very striking place. Yeah.
Yeah, it's just like a different world.
Yeah, that's true. Yes, and it's very it's completely unspoiled, of course, on the Baffin side, particularly. So it's pristine, almost as it used to always be, has been.
Yeah. So if anybody's got any questions, there's a chat box along the same bit where you can share your videos and things, or if you just want to come in and speak, I'm happy with that as well. Some people don't like talking, but if you want to write a message in the chat box, that would be great. We've got a couple of people saying that many thanks, very enjoyable, and you really communicated the atmosphere of the Wild Bunch. And thank you, amazing photographs, really awesome. So
that's very kind, thank you.
Another one says, tremendous talk, thank you, and for making some lovely references to things beyond. And we've also got, thanks, amazing guys, the Wild Bunch.
Yeah, they are. Yeah.
And somebody's asking a question here that says, I was wondering, what made you choose that specific type of boat? Special characteristics or something else?
Well, no, because originally we bought the first Derridus Light in 1981, really just as a family thing to do, to go sailing, all seven of us. And at that time I was down in England and kept it on the south coast. So we went across to France and that sort of thing. Our first ocean passage. Again, by this time, family had found other things gradually to do. They're quite good sailors. And I was using it more and more for the school where I was chaplain. And so I took school parties across to France and that sort of thing. And as I say, our first ocean passage was to the Azores in 1984. In those days, of course, it was a more serious undertaking because all the navigation was by astro navigation, no GPS or anything of that nature. And we gradually pushed out the frontiers. When I retired, I took some lads who had sailed with me at the school, and we sailed around the world and all that sort of thing. And that's when David built that fiberglass cuddy for me for the Southern Ocean and Cape Horn and so forth. But yeah, it wasn't bought with the Arctic in mind. It just, when I got back from around the world, well, what should we do now? Well, I had read Bill Tillman's books and realized that you could go to the Arctic, to Greenland, climb mountains from the boat and get back all in one summer. So that's what we started to do. So it
Is
just
that-
developed gradually. And I just happened to find that I was in a fiberglass boat in icy conditions. So we had to do our sailing accordingly.
That's what I was quite interested in as well, as how you came to decide to just go to the Arctic. So that's interesting to hear that.
Well, yes, because going around the world, it had taken us 3 months to get to the Falkland Islands, and another month, say, in Antarctica, and then it would have been, after doing the work around the world, if we'd done it, gone down to the Antarctic again, would have been 3 months back again. But suddenly, as I say, I realized that you could go to Greenland, climb, and sail back again all in one summer. So that was a no-brainer, as I think they say these days.
Yeah, definitely. And that kind of ties into the next question. Somebody is asking, how long did you leave the boat in the Arctic, and did you sail
Right.
it from Europe?
To begin with, I was doing just that. I was sailing across, climbing, and sailing back. I got a bit tired of this, so as I was intending to come back again afterwards, after the whatever expedition I was on at the time, I found, first of all, the boatyard at Aasiaat, which to begin with, for a number of years, was quite reasonable. I think that he sort of took pity on a poor yachtsman as opposed to the big fishing boats that were being maintained there, and let me pull out at a reasonable fee. It was only that when it had got new management that the fees suddenly shot up to astronomical proportions. So it was really to leave the boat there, to save sailing it back and then sailing it back again the following summer in order to do another expedition. And that worked out pretty well. I did that at least 3 times. And at one stage, actually, it was in the Arctic for 3 winters. That included the Northwest Passage and going across to Alaska and leaving it in Alaska, of course. But that worked out very well, and apart from the damage that was done on one occasion. And of course, it made the start of the expeditions much more easy because you didn't have to sail the Atlantic to get there.
So when you sailed back to this country, did you sail back with people as well?
Oh, yes. Yes,
Yeah.
I've never really been into single-handed sailing. I enjoy having a crew and it works very well. So yes, I've been fortunate like that. It's as I've written in this new book, Addicted to More Adventures, it's strange how you collect crews sometimes, but somehow it's always come together. No, not just the Wild Bunch, and it's worked out well, and I enjoy that. I think I enjoy having people around rather than just being on my own.
Yeah, definitely. I imagine it'd be quite a long and solitary stint if you were just on your own.
Would. One of my mentors, a guy called Willie Carr, he's died now, he was about 10 years older than me, but he used to sail in a Contessa 32, even smaller than mine, single-handed across the Atlantic to Greenland regularly, and then back again. But he said it was less trouble not having crew, but actually, as I say, I rather enjoy having crew.
I suppose that would be one benefit. Nobody would answer back, but
Well, there is that, yes. You wouldn't have any queries, yeah.
Yes, well, exactly. But I guess then though the workload must be so much more. You wouldn't be able to rest for any amount of time, and kind of ever really get a proper rest.
No, quite. That's another factor, of course. I mean, one of the reasons why I didn't go for single-handed sailing was that I could, because you're meant to get up every so often and have a look around, see there's no other ships or anything, and I couldn't trust myself not to sleep through. So I, as I say, preferred to go with other people.
Yeah, that's one thing I noticed as well, is that I imagine that there's not really much chance to get some sleep. 'Cause I noticed in most of the photos you're sleeping sitting up. So
well, yes. That used to worry the schoolboys because they weren't sure whether I was asleep or whether I was awake watching them. So that wasn't the reason why I did it. I did it because I think I wasn't eating very well at the time, so I had sort of indigestion. And also I have to be careful of my lumbar regions in the back. I usually put a towel or something there. So over many years now, I found it easier to sleep half sitting up.
I thought it was just so you can spring into action.
I suppose it does have that that advantage as well.
Somebody else has asked a question saying, what would you have done if you dropped off the climbers and they did not reappear?
Right. Yes. It's a very good question. And I mean, we were aware that there's no rescue operation, of course, in Greenland or especially in Baffin. So it was entirely a matter of self-rescue if you really had to. There was the advantage that you did have a boat though, so when you found your person, or if somebody was injured and you got him down to the boat, you could then move to a settlement, because especially on the west coast of Greenland, all the settlements do have a hospital. Again, it used to be a Danish colony, and a lot of the infrastructure is Danish, and it is manned a little bit more by the locals now, but by and large, it's still mainly done by the Danes. But there is hospital facilities available in each of these settlements as you go up the west coast of Greenland. So that is a plus, and you have a boat to get them there. But at the same time, it is all self-rescue. So you'd have to get yourself down, or the rest of the party would have to get the injured person down, and this sort of thing.
I imagine that there's probably a lot of preparation and things that you probably think about all that beforehand.
Well, we had a fairly comprehensive first aid kit in case.
Yeah, I suppose you're so isolated out there, aren't you? That
well, completely isolated. It's got to be self-sufficient. You're entirely responsible yourself.
And seeing some of that pictures of the climbers up the mountains, it literally made me feel weak at the knees.
Yeah.
It gives you a real sense of the scale when you see the tiny little ant-like figures climbing up these huge mountains. It's just amazing.
Yes.
Not for the faint-hearted.
Not for the faint-hearted. But they are consummate climbers.
Yeah, definitely. So certainly.
They're in world-class climbers, I suppose, really.
It's certainly not for the faint-hearted anyway.
No.
And it's certainly very inspirational. And you as well, Bob. It's unbelievable just to be able to go to those parts of the world, and especially not be able to navigate around it as well. It's just unbelievable. It's
strange, really, because we didn't think like that at all. It just seemed the natural thing to do. But nowadays, people seem to be quite surprised. Oh, you went there in a 10-meter boat, because everybody has much bigger boats now, of course. So yeah, it seemed quite natural to us at the time, but people don't seem to think so today, which is strange.
Yeah, you've obviously been doing something right.
Yeah. Well, that's nice to know.
Well, thanks very much, Bob. That's been absolutely fantastic. Everybody's really enjoyed it. And getting
it's great to be with you, and I hope sometime we may actually all meet up somewhere.
Yes, definitely. Yeah. We'll get you to Orkney yet.
Okay.
I've just got one final question just popped through here saying, when was that expedition?
Right, that expedition was 2014. We done the Northwest Passage in 2012, east to west, and then west to east in 2013. So the Wild Bunch came out again in 2014. We done an expedition together in 2010, again, just on the west coast of Greenland, where they climbed some superb routes, including that route you saw them at the top when I started off and described the Wild Bunch. They were on the top of what we called Impossible Wall, but it wasn't impossible because they had managed to climb it. So that was good.
We've got another question here. If you're happy to answer more
Yeah,
questions.
sure.
It says a question regarding the amount of actual sailing time when you were at Baffin Island as compared to motoring.
Right. Okay. That's quite searching. I would think, to be honest, we did more motoring than sailing. Strangely, because Baffin Bay, as I described, going out there, which was pure sailing from Greenland to Baffin, but Baffin Bay can be quite lively. But on the way back from Clyde River back to Sisimiut, we had to motor most of the way. In fact, it was rather strange, which is yeah. So we did have to do more motoring, certainly over on the Baffin side, than sailing.
That's interesting, because I did see it, like in some of the pictures. Obviously, it kind of went from one extreme to another. It'd be kind of glassy calm at times, and then other times it'd be blowing a gale.
Yes. Well, that's it. I've just written to somebody actually who's editing heavy weather sailing, and that Greenland, for instance, is you either have too much wind or too little, and it's a land of extremes, if you like.
Well, that's great. I think that's all the questions now, so we can wrap up with that. But thank you very much again. We've got people applauding there, so yes.
Right. Thank you very much. It's been great to be with you, as I say.
Yes, it's been lovely, and I'm glad we could do it virtually, and hopefully we'll get an in-person meet at some point too.
Right. I'm just trying to get out of this now. I think I can. Okay.
Perfect. Great. Thank
you.
Thank you very much anyway.
Lovely.
Thank you very much, everybody, for coming.
You were very good there, Mike.
Good.